Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Jennifer Dill, and I'm going to be introducing today's seminar and speaker. So our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are usually held live on the Portland State University campus, located downtown Portland, and also located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, today's seminar is hosted fully online and will be for the near future. This fall's Friday Transportation Seminar lineup, we have been focusing on the broad topic of equity in transportation, recent research and practice. Oops, sorry. There we go. Today's speaker, we are very happy to have Nikatris Perkins join us today. She'll be presenting on curating equitable transportation. Nikatris is a Wisconsin native and has 20 years of experience working in nonprofit, social enterprise, and corporate environments towards equitable outcomes. She is the new Assistant Director of Social Equity at the Oregon Department of Transportation, where she is focusing on assisting ODOT stakeholders in thinking about how we prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion, and addressing systemic barriers to all Oregonians benefiting from transportation services and investments. Before we go to today's talk, I just want to tell you about a couple upcoming seminars. So next week, we're going to have Mike Dolan-Fliss from the University of North Carolina's Injury Prevention Research Center, presenting some research on racial disparities in traffic enforcement. And the following week, which will be our final seminar of the fall term, we have Stephen Higashidi, who is the author of the book, Better Buses, Better Cities. So just a quick overview. As you all have figured out by now, we are using GoToWebinar for today's event. We are recording the webinar, and we will post the recording and the slides online afterwards. You will also get an email with links to those resources, so you can watch again, share with your colleagues, and keep it for future reference. As normal, the webinar has been approved for an hour of continuing education credit. And the presentation will be about 40 or so minutes, and afterwards we'll have time for questions. If you want to ask a question, use the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel, type your question in there. You can do that during the seminar, but we'll hold it until the end when my colleague, Professor Chris Monsieur, who is here with me, and he and I will ask those questions. And hopefully we'll get to them all, but if not, we share those with the speaker afterwards. So without further ado, whoops, I shouldn't have advanced the slide. Without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our speaker.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to make sure that my words are captioning. It looks like they are. I figured that out. That's exciting. I am Nikatris Perkins, and I'm really excited to be here. I am, as Jennifer said, new to Oregon, new to ODOT, and yeah, really excited about all the things that are happening in this space. So I want to spend some time today talking about curating equity. And the series for Friday Transportation Seminars, I've watched a couple of them already, a lot of amazing things, practice, theory, data. I want to offer that curating equity is really about a how, right? It's really thinking about curation as a practice, as a strategy to moving systems towards equity. So I'm planning, I'm visioning, I'm really more visioning than planning, working myself out of a job. But when I think about that, like that's a phrase everyone uses, I'm talking about working for 2 generations, right? So Generation Alpha, which in case you're not keeping up with the generation, so people who were born in 2010 and later will experience my career to the fullest. And so in thinking about that, I have to think about how things ripple, which is why I think curation is a very good way to think about equity, especially in terms of transportation. So curating equity for me is filtering, it's synthesizing, it's framing, collaborating, revising, restructuring. Oftentimes when people think about, how you're going to plan a system, you're going to line things up, we're going to take something away. The reality is when you're thinking about curation, some things don't fit. Some things need to be thrown away. Some things are not for this exhibition. Some things are not necessary. Some things are so necessary that you have to prioritize them over other things that would really fit well, but there's not space for them here. And so when I'm thinking about curation, I'm thinking about what it means to go from a place where we have been patient with people and process, and we take a little bit at a time, and we think about how we might be able to think about all of our studies and our theories and use every single piece of that, to how we become impatient with process, impatient with policy, impatient with procedure, and remain patient with people. As a person who is this isn't working, throw it all away, let's start over again, curation says that even though there's going to be a hard time, curation of equity says even though there's going to be a hard time with some policy and some procedure and some process, patience with people is imperative, right? So a good curator is someone who pays attention well. A great curator is someone who pays attention well and then gives context for others to understand why they might pay attention well, right? So I can't be impatient with people in equity, even though it is very, very easy, because it's sometimes I don't understand how you wouldn't want everyone to be well or have access or resource. But I also understand that we live in a place where we've been socialized with misinformation, where we have very binary lenses and experiences, and curation allows us to open that up. And so when I think about curation of equity, I'm thinking about a couple of things. One, I want to take a second and think about all the places that it shows up, right? So this is a very poor illustration, which is why I'm telling you exactly where to look for it. It's from the Community and Actions Report, Pathways to Health Equity, which oftentimes when we're talking about transportation in specific, we think about health, we think about climate, we think about environmental justice, we think about active transportation, we think about pedestrian safety. But the reality is that maintenance and reconstruction and resurfacing is also health equity. Where highways are, where roads are, paving is also health equity. So when you see models like this, transportation is called out. And I feel like in my experience thus far in transportation spaces, we're often thinking about active transportation, and everybody's not connected to this. But in order for us to be in a space where structural inequities and biases are not part of people's daily lives, it's going to be necessary for everybody to think about how they broaden their view, right? So it's imperative to think about the big picture and find a niche in a moment, even if it is not permanent. So in doing that, you want to make sure that this is distributed in a way that requires you to think outside of a box that you might have been thinking in before right now. So what I offer is that curating equity, specifically in transportation, requires you focus on a unique vision. It requires consideration of a broader context. It requires planning with space and a place in mind, and it requires building a reliable team. As a practitioner dedicated to collective liberation, it means that I'm responsible to learn all the pieces of a place and identify intersections that where interest convergence happen and then make moves, right? And so when I think about a unique vision, I'm not thinking about unique in terms of there's no other vision like this, but I need to zero in on a vision that really does think about how, again, structural inequalities will be dismantled. When I think about a broader context, I'm thinking about things outside of my specialty. So it is amazing to work in ODOT or among engineers and planners and researchers, and people who call themselves the data geeks. That's not my title for them, that's theirs. People who are in human resources and who are thinking about workforce, people who are thinking about contracting and procurement and community, like all of those people work in one space. And so every little thing we do affects all of that, even just internally. So we have to be clear that it affects all of that in communities and for ODOT statewide, right? Planning with space and place in mind. Curation, which is often connected to an art space. I think this is one place where it's easy to draw that connection. There's a place where you would find an art gallery in certain neighborhoods. There's art districts, there's theater districts. Sometimes you find the best art galleries under a bridge, around a corner that you didn't expect it to be, on the bottom of apartment buildings, next to restaurants. But then there's also, that's the place they're in, right? But then there's also the space, right? What kind of corners do you need to walk around? Is it just a large open space? And that is very true for transportation as well. And oftentimes we're thinking about the larger network, right? In terms of place and how it's going to connect people from A to B, and oftentimes how we're going to get vehicles from A to B or from B to D and all of these different points of the network. But additionally, we have to think about space. People live in these places. People are living, they're working, and they're playing. And as transportation practitioners and experts and subject matter experts, we are people who are responsible for people's health in those spaces based on our impact in transportation. And then building a reliable team. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I will dig into it a little bit, but a reliable team, I think sometimes we don't think about how big that reliable team is. And it's not about just my project team. It is also about the people who live in the communities that are impacted by decisions and investments that I might be involved in, right? So I might not even be making the decision or investment, but if I'm involved in it at any point I sit at a table, I need to make sure that I'm thinking about who's missing and whose voice isn't being heard and whose voice is very, very loud and who isn't, right? And those are the things that are required in curating equity. Because again, we're thinking about how not only am I thinking about this space, but how do I make sure other people are drawing attention in this space? So this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So I want to be very clear and give you some examples. So I'm going to use ODOT, right? So I've been at ODOT for about 6 months. And I'm sharing this with you today for a couple of reasons. One, because ODOT has been talking about equity and thinking about equity for years, long before I got here. We've been studying, we've been thinking, and now we're in a position where we need to be held to task. And what are you doing? At the same time, I've been here for 6 months. So Nicatrus, what are you doing today? And so we're starting here. What does it look like to curate equity in this space? And I'm sharing it also because I want to, even though it's not completely built out, I want you to hold me to task, right? So however many people are on this webinar, people who see it beyond this space, I want you to be able to email me, call me, text me, tweet me about, remember you set up Curating Equity and ODOT would show up in that space. I'm not seeing it. How's it going? What's happening? So these are the things that I said were necessary or required in curating equity. And I want to talk about how ODOT is showing up right there as we think about this right now. One is a unique vision. Again, it's not a vision that is, there's nobody else thinking about this. It's how we're zeroing in. So the Office of Social Equity at ODOT is prioritizing equity or prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion by identifying and addressing systemic barriers to ensure all Oregonians benefit from transportation services and investments. So in a lot of places you see visions and you're like, oh, that's nice. That's all the words that you need to have a vision statement and be thinking about what that looks like. When I think about this vision, it's short term. This is how you should be able to think about ODOT within the next 10 years, where you will be able to look at ODOT and say, I know for sure they prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is how I know. I can see some of the systemic barriers that either we have created because we're a large transportation organization and systems have been problematic for as long as there have been systems in our country. So how are we addressing some of the barriers we've created? How are we addressing some of the barriers that we're complicit in? And where are we identifying barriers that affect those that we have the honor of serving that we might not be able to change right away? So when I think about that, I think about some of the ways we might do procurement or contracting. There are some barriers in there that we control, and how can we shift those to make there be more for there to be more opportunity for other people. There's also spaces where um, maybe public transportation needs to be more accessible, or the routes need to be different, or we need to be able to read different or hear different languages at bus stops or braille. There's a lot of different things that could happen at a bus stop or inside of public transportation. And though we're involved in a lot of those spaces, and we might be collaborating with different agencies, we don't run a large public transportation space, but that has nothing to do with our involvement, right? In terms of what it looks like to identify barriers and hold people to task and be at the table in terms of how we can be involved in addressing those barriers. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of the vision is all Oregonians benefit. Oftentimes when people are talking about equity, they say all, and then it's like all, the end, you know we mean all. This is one of those times, right? But I want to be very clear again, so you can hold me to task and hold ODOT to task. When we say all, we literally mean all. We understand that right now there are many people benefiting from our transportation services and investments. And in a lot of spaces, people who identify as Black, Indigenous, tribal nations, sovereign nations, Hispanic, Latinx, Latino, Latina, Asian Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian, limited English proficiency, people living with different abilities, people who identify as disabled, people who are aging, young people, they're not benefiting from all of our transportation services and investments like others are. So when we say all, it means that no matter what your social demographic or your identity, that you are benefiting in a very similar way to everyone else who is currently benefiting, right? So we're thinking about the just distribution of benefit and burden. The second thing is place and space. So we're talking about statewide, talking about rural, metropolitan, and suburban areas. And so, yep, there are very specific places that we're talking about. In that, there are spaces that we affect. We affect workforce, we affect policy, we affect project selection, not only ours, but other entities in transportation policy or project selection. We affect the economics of community and the environment and climate hazards in community. And so we have to be cognizant of that. And curating our network and deciding what it looks like for transportation to run well through ODOT, those things have to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about how to do it in an equitable manner. In terms of broader context, this is something I just kind of alluded to, but social identities that have been historically and are currently disproportionately burdened by systems used to distribute power, resource, and access, we have to think about that. I say to distribute power, resource, and access, and not just transportation, because in order for us to think about transportation, it goes back to the, again, very poor visual, I apologize, from the Community in Action Public Health Report, because transportation moves into education, which moves into housing, which moves into criminal justice, which moves into food justice, which moves into human services. And so how are agencies collaborating together and thinking about how the things I do are not necessarily just about transportation, but there's a ripple effect in that. And so I need to be sure that I'm thinking about the broader context in terms of all of those systems and the part that transportation plays. And then finally, a reliable team. Again, I say, that sounds easy, like you want to have a reliable team. I think that though, when you think about curating equity, sometimes there's people we don't think about being a part of our team. So one, it's internal. From a transportation, specifically transportation at ODOT, internal means you're talking to all of those teams I just named, right? Like, yes, I'm talking to engineers, and yes, I'm talking to planners, and yes, I'm talking to project managers and construction and Office of Civil Rights and mega projects and small projects and pilot projects and all the people in between, active transportation, grant. There's just so many people who play different parts, and all of those people are part of a reliable team, which means that all of those people need to understand equity and be thinking about equity in their corner of the agency. And we have external stakeholders, right? There's commission, there are legislators, there's citizenry, there's people who are depending on ODOT to always be There are people who are depending on ODOT to always be delivering on their promises and to be spending the public's money responsibly, right? And so responsible depends on, again, that broader context. Some people are like, as long as I can get on the expressway, I'm great. And some people are thinking about it from an economic opportunity purview. The other thing is that new and seasoned. And I say new and seasoned, thinking about people who have been in transportation and have been thinking about transportation for the last 22 years. And I think about people who have been thinking about equity for the last 22 years, but not transportation. And I think about people who are in high school right now, who are really steeped in what equity looks like for the next generation, but sometimes they're not at the table to talk. And I'm thinking about people who have never understood the amount of decisions and impact that transportation has on their everyday life. So when a survey goes out and says, hey, tell us what you think about some transportation investments, they don't understand because it's not something in their purview, because there's not something they've been integrated into. And so we need to get to a place where we're also involving community, not just consulting them, right, or informing them of projects, but involving them in what it looks like to understand the larger systems and the power they have in that process. Because right now, in a lot of corners of a lot of spaces, they're not involved. They know what's on their block or in their immediate neighborhood, but by the time people learn about what something does for them or doesn't do for them, or how it's problematic or how it could be assistive, it's too late. Like, the project is done. And so how do we do it when we're not talking about, well, in 1950, this was built, right? Right now, there's a lot of conversation nationwide about what highways did. I don't know if anyone saw the article in the LA Times that talked about while people were tearing down monuments, that tearing down the expressway was a monument. It was a monument to segregation. And so what does it look like to tear those down? Right? So by the time we're just now talking about that and how long ago they were built, means it's too late, because now we're talking about how to restructure them, how to resurface them, how to maintain them. And so as we build different networks, we need to make sure that those networks are informed by our entire team and people who are reliable, not just today and in expertise, but are reliable from experience, because they're living inside of the system. So I want to talk about, so that's our idea, right? I want to talk about what paying attention well would mean, right? So if you're a good curator, you're paying attention well. So I think that that means that you're working with a group of problem solvers and creative analytic minds. I have met the minds that see things from so many different angles. I have yet to be in a room full of transportation professionals, experts, people that have careers in transportation. That's actually the wording I would like to use. People with careers in transportation who do not define themselves as problem solvers, right? I've yet to meet that group. So when you're thinking about that, that is a good way to pay attention. Some people who are dedicated to seeing a problem and solving it. So what does it look like to be able to help them pay attention to other problems within a problem, to shift, to pivot, and think about how things that might look like a very static problem are larger than they seem. Another thing in terms of paying attention well is being clear that we decide where people go, where they do not, and in addition to their safety as they move. And so many of you, I'm sure, have studied at this point. You're getting credit for classes, or you're interested in transportation or working in transportation. So yes, transportation in terms of urban renewal or suburbanization has really thought about what it meant to get people from suburbs to downtown areas. We've moved populations multiple times because people were priced out based on where transportation access was, major expressways and highways. We've, at this point, moved people to kind of really suburbanized poverty in a lot of ways, moving people away from downtown centers. And so we're deciding who goes where. Sometimes we also don't think about, in doing that, those small town main streets that were bustling as a part of economic, just the economics of a city or small city or town or village. Expressways have moved people out of that space. So at one point, you always drove down Main Street. Now you don't need to do that. So we decide that people don't need to go that way. And there's economic inopportunity issue in that space. And so can we fix it all? Maybe not in terms of tearing everything up, but we need to be clear that we did make decisions, right? And owning those decisions. Because I work in transportation, even if I wasn't here when those decisions are made, My role is to be clear about transportation was responsible for those decisions in terms of which way people did go and what they do see in their travel and what they don't. And then how are they safe in those spaces? Are those spaces safe for people to walk, for people to jog, for people to be in bikes, for people to be in wheelchairs or on scooters? What does that look like? And can people move well in all of those spaces safely? Is it safe for everybody to be out at dusk? Do we have enough lights? Are we partnering with different cities or counties to ensure that, you know, beacons are in the right place, or that you can see certain skin tones depending on dusk and twilight? Those are things that sometimes we don't think about, but you're in a room full of the best problem solvers. And so curating really allows you to pay attention well from that standpoint. It also can give you a moment where you can give context for others to pay attention well, right? So this will move us to being a great curator. I really do think that I have not met anybody yet, being at ODOT or talking to anybody in transportation, that's not a good curator, because there are problem solvers. They're doing all the things that I said on the last slide. Environmental justice is something that's thought about. But in terms of getting context for others to pay attention well and collaborate, I think we're missing the mark, right? So that's what I'm offering. What does it look like for us to pay attention well, to curate well, and give context for others to pay attention well? And these are the three things that come to mind. Very recently, I heard Tamika Butler speaking, and she talked about how we're all transportation dependent. And that phrase, I feel like, sums up so many things I've tried to explain many times. So we're all dependent on, there's so much research that says the transportation dependent versus everyone else. But the reality is, I am for sure dependent on people who are riding the bus. I'm dependent on people who are walking. I'm depending on people who are getting goods from one place to another. So sometimes we remove ourselves, right? Like, oh, I have nothing to do with rail. That's not my thing. And also, you order from Amazon or you order from wherever, and it gets to a place, and that didn't get there magically. Trucks were used in that, rail was used in that. What are the climate implications? What aren't the climate implications? Why aren't we talking in more ways around how we can collaborate better? What they need, what we need. We're all transportation dependent. It doesn't mean that we are looking at a place where it's just talking about people with vehicles or without. I'm dependent on people who are not driving vehicles, absolutely. And so I need to be clear about what people without vehicles need when I'm planning a space as a person who drives a car almost everywhere I go, right? And also, to give context and to paying attention well, I think that there's a quote from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And actually, it's not a quote, it's just an expectation that they put out, that an engineer is expected not only to protect the public in his or her own work, but also to take action if he or she or they have knowledge that any other person's actions might undermine the public welfare. And so that's a really broad term, right? And I think that undermine the public welfare is sometimes where it gets so broad that we forget that who the public is and what it means for people to be able to live in a healthy manner. When you think about protecting the public for transportation, do people have access, right? Transportation and transportation roadways provide access to resources. If people don't have access to food or access to education or access to health care in terms of being able to get there safely, are we doing what's necessary from a planning and project standpoint in transportation? How can we open that up and tap our friends in other agencies and other departments and other entities about what it looks like to make sure that our projects line up so that public welfare, people being able to live a life that is not disproportionately burdened by not having access to what we have decided are basic human needs, right? Food, health, shelter. How do we make sure that that happens? And then lastly, giving context for others to pay attention well would be focusing on how our investments ripple, affecting both product and process. So I think that I've had a lot of experience in talking about this is the end product, and you can explain it. There are examples of it. We show you the mock-up, we show you the map, we show you everything, grand ideas of what the product will look like. But our investments also affect the process. It affects who is clear about their voice being heard. It affects who knows that they're ignored. What I have learned over the last few months, very particular to Portland, is that there have been a lot of conversations around tables for many years. And there are people who some would designate as the squeaky wheel. But when I have listened to them with, you know, new ears, just because I'm new to the area, I listen to new ears, like everything they're saying makes exact perfect sense. And the answer is, oh, they've been saying that for years. So why haven't we been doing the things that they're talking about? Because what they're talking about is clear inequity, okay, around race, around class, around how people have been left out. Communities have been decimated. Generational poverty has been cemented in some ways by systems. And so we're responsible for that. How do we shift that? And we have to focus on that ripple effect, because what we're doing right now is going to affect, right, the generation that was born in 2010 or 2020. And we don't want somebody making this presentation then talking about how I just can't believe that that is what they did, and it's just unfathomable. We're going to fix it all, because we can fix a lot of those things now. I'm positive that at some point somebody else has had this conversation in the last 10 years. And so how do we really pivot our process to ensure that our product is something that shows our investment into all, right, into public welfare, into everybody, regardless of social demographic or social container that was decided by systems in order to put us in a hierarchy that ensure that there is burden. And so that's an interruption into a system, even though we're inside of a system, and benefit from it, right? Like we work here, we get paid by, I definitely am getting paid by ODOT. And so I'm benefiting from a system, and I have a responsibility to ensure that other people are benefiting, if not in a way that is very similar to mine, benefiting more because of the burdens that they see in other spaces. So kind of in wrapping this up, I want to go back. Actually, no, I won't. I'll just go here. So as a curator, you're a catalyst. And so I want to talk about how, as a curator for equity, it's not about having the answer, and it's being a catalyst for the answer. Oftentimes, I think that as problem solvers and planners, we think about we're going to come up with the thing that solves the thing for everyone, right? There's an issue and people are overly burdened by not being able to get to the things they need. People are overly burdened by how economics has, whether it's because of the businesses that are no longer there, or because of the streets we no longer drive down, or because there's no access to the business that people want to start or have started, or their businesses aren't, like, economics or health or all of those things, right? We're not trying to solve the issue. We're providing a catalyst for the answer. I think that oftentimes we think of ourselves as the answer. So as assistant director of social equity, I am not the answer, but I'm the person that's going to open up as many doors as possible, open up as many reports as possible, go to as many webinars, have as many conversations, and build as many relationships as possible, because there's no way for us to get to a place where we're identifying and addressing systemic barriers if we're not clear how those things are barriers for all people. Especially we're talking about making people, all Oregonians, able to benefit from our transportation investments and systems. When I also think about this, I think that it's sometimes, in terms of being a catalyst, I think that sometimes it's easy, again, for us to disconnect. So a catalyst can also be maintenance and rehabilitation and reconstruction, because we are focused on infrastructure in a lot of places, and some of that infrastructure has created harm. So how do we become clear on the practice of what we're doing in terms of process that creates products that affect generations upon generations? I speak really fast, so unfortunately, I'm already done. So I do want to open it up to questions. I can answer them slow, though, and definitely dig in some more places if that makes sense. Jennifer?
Great, thank you. I've been sitting here thinking about this last one. That I love that idea of being a catalyst for the answer. I'm actually, we have at least a couple questions that have come in, but I've thought of a few of myself that maybe I'm
Okay.
going to kick things off with. And you focused in on one of your slides. You had the quote from Tamika Butler, and then you had something
Mhm.
from the ASCE, and you talked a few times about people being problem solvers, transportation
Yep.
professionals being problem solvers, and you also emphasized sort of the role of decisions. and how the decisions we make have impacts. And those are things that I think a lot about in transportation. And I'm wondering if you might reflect a little bit on how we define the problem. Because I think I often hear from some of the engineers that I respect the most that they want to do great things and they want to solve problems, and then I think it often comes back to how we define the problem. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that and how it affects the type of work that you're trying to do.
I do have thoughts on that. A couple of thoughts. One, I think that defining the problem is not as linear as it would be nice for it to be. So you like you think about problem statements and you're in an office and we're trying to figure out the plan. So what's the problem statement? So we can figure out the scope of work so we can keep going, right? The problem is people can't get from this neighborhood to this neighborhood. Okay, make a straight line and then we continue to go. So I think that defining the problem, unfortunately, has not included the people who are experiencing the problem we're defining. And so in defining a problem, I think about how we think about our own personal lives. Like if the issue is I can't get anything, I don't know, like I can't get enough done in a day, so I wake up earlier. Like I make that plan for myself based on a problem. And in these transportation spaces, we're trying to figure that out for millions of people. And so how do we involve community in a way that the definition of the problem is as informed by the community as the solution to the problem, which is someplace that it just takes way more work. It takes way more resources. It takes way more work. It takes, I mean, everybody's not going to respond to an online survey. Everybody's not going to come to a forum. Everybody's not going to do text messaging or social media. So it's about figuring out how we reach the people who are experiencing the problem we think we know to ensure that they're involved in the final definition of that. And I also think that that means that there has to be, one, there's going to be some ambiguity that scientists and engineers are not necessarily fond of. And then two, I think there's going to be some space where people need to be a little bit more comfortable not knowing. Because if you're hired as the person that's going to solve the problem, right? Like Nicotra's Perkins was hired to solve equity. I don't know a whole bunch of things, right? Like I know a lot about equity. I know a lot about different things. I know a lot about a lot, but I know I don't know it all. And I'm okay saying like, this is what I see. And what do you see? And I think that we've been socialized to think that when you're either hired for a position or you're put in a position or somebody calls your name in that type of setting, that you're supposed to have an answer. Instead of turning to like, I'm so glad you called on me so we can have a dialogue and let's really kind of figure this out. So I think that those are the things in terms of defining the problem that stand out to me that are a little uncomfortable in terms of how if you went to school for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, so many years, people expect for you to have the answer, even if that's just how you define the problem and exactly what the wording is so we can move forward. I don't think that's fair in terms of how we get to the end result that makes sense for everybody.
So maybe digging a little bit deeper on one of those points you brought up, how does a curator look at conducting public involvement so that voices that are not traditionally heard are included?
Yeah, so it means that there has to be so many ways that we're involving voices. I've really been thinking a lot about this because I think that public engagement is in many ways the missing piece to us deciding problems and to us figuring out how to solve them. And I do realize that it is resource intensive, right? So like I did a very huge public involvement campaign in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the ways that we did it, or even when you just think about organizing, I think that's another way when you can think about public involvement and how many people you have on text messages alone. I don't know if anybody else was receiving 17 text messages a day until election day, but like text messaging and surveys on my email, and I was seeing commercials and things were on my Instagram and my Twitter, and I received something in the mail. And the reality is I only really engaged with one of those. I saw all of that, but I only answered text messages. And so how do we figure out, I think, to better collaborate? Because I don't think that makes sense. Like ODOT is going to take on all of those vehicles for collaboration. Instead, there's many, just thinking about the state, there's so many state agencies. Why aren't we all thinking together of what it looks like to better engage and involve public, so that there's a way that there's 10, 25 questions that hits what everybody's trying to figure out, so that we better collaborate. I think that collaboration around public engagement is probably the way to go and would allow us to best use our resources, and be efficient around figuring out how to move forward. So we're not stuck in that, we're gathering, we're talking, we think we might know in a little while, just give us another second, but we're able to move forward, which I also think is a place that has people, public, not trust agencies or even an organization, a corporation. Like, you don't trust it because it's taking so long for you to do something, you're just talking about doing it. So I would think that collaboration around public involvement is probably something that would be most beneficial, because it is resource heavy, and it is about making sure that all the different ways that people engage with their environment and their lives and other people is hit when you're thinking about how to get their opinion or their thoughts about how they live their lives.
Great. We have a question from one of our students that I think builds on that a little bit. And recognizing that you've only joined ODOT fairly recently, wondering if you could provide any examples from ODOT of that sort of collaboration with stakeholders to curate equity, maybe from your time, or maybe looking forward, what you see on the horizon too, given.
Yeah, sure. I think that we're curating equity right now in pockets, right? So I think there are a lot of different ways we involve community, like, for instance. But when we think about how we are, oh, you know what? I have a very specific example. So right now, there's a desire for there's a need for there to be a state map that helps us understand social demographics, that helps us understand then safety, electric vehicles, public transportation, health indicators, where the jobs are versus where the people live. And that one map doesn't necessarily exist. However, like 6 different types of maps and tools do exist in different corners of the agency that people were using very specifically for themselves. And then there's other agencies who are like, hey, we should make a map. And we see Portland did a really good map. Seattle's done a really good map. How do we do that for the entire state? And so all of what has happened is that just because of where I sit, I get a whole bunch of pings, right? So I got a ping from at least 12 different angles where I was like, if we all sat in one room, I bet you we could come up with the answer. And truthfully, in 2 meetings, it was way easier than I think we expected it to be, because it was like, oh, the map exists. And so we have a pilot literally in less than a month, right? By the time we got everybody that was talking about it in different places, and now there's other agencies talking about it too. And that type of tool, especially if we can get it to be interactive, would totally change the way we can collaborate among agencies, within an agency. And so I think that those efficiencies are things that we have a really hard time communicating with, because we have our head down and we're really trying to focus on the problems that we are assigned to fix. I think that's a good example of what it would look like to curate equity, and how we're trying to figure, at least one way we're trying to figure that out at ODOT right now.
So as you can imagine, it's hard to have a conversation, particularly in the Portland area, involving ODOT when the issue of the Rose Quarter Freeway expansion doesn't come up.
Yep.
And so there's a couple questions about that. And maybe I'll just ask you broadly, sort of how your office is involved or not involved, and where you see some of what you're talking about moving forward with that project.
Oh, you did the broadest way to ask it possible. Yes.
Well, there's more than one question here.
Yeah,
So
fair. So I will say that, so how is my office involved? How is it not involved? And where do I see the project going? Is that what
Sure.
we're saying? So my office is not really all that quote unquote involved in Rose Quarter. I think that I would put my office more involved in the urban mobility office, which is not just Rose Quarter, but it's tolling and it's the Interstate Bridge Project. So in the bigger context, It's consistently asking questions around benefit and burden, around how we define things. So I'll give an example about Rose Quarter. There was a lot of conversation before I even started about what restorative justice looks like in this space. How I defined restorative justice and how a colleague defines restorative justice and how a couple of other agencies who are like, what is ODOT talking about, define restorative justice, were different. And so getting on into a space where language has been problematic for us, I think, because we want to do the right thing. And I think that sometimes we might not know what the right thing is because we haven't always had enough players at the table from community who are experiencing or have experienced the shifts of any of those large urban mobility projects. So how do we make sure that we understand the economic impact, not just today in terms of contracting, but it's going to have an economic impact 20 years from now. We need to understand that as well. So I think that my office is involved by really kind of having some of those conversations internally and really listening externally a lot, and saying like, this is what I'm hearing. And my equity lens says that this is why somebody is saying this, and this is how somebody hasn't been engaged. This is why this is important, and this is why we need to put more resources in this space in terms of involving community, not just on the committees, but in day-to-day conversation and understanding how people are moving in the neighborhoods. So I think that's one way my office is involved. I don't think it's directly, but it's helping understand how, one, this impacts how we move in social equity agency-wide. And two, the things that in thinking about the impact, what we've done well or tried to do well, and where we have gaps and opportunities for growth and doing work better. So that's, I think, how my office is involved and not involved. In terms of where it's going, right now they're building a new advisory committee after partners have shifted. And so as that happens, we're also hiring somebody to really think about economic equity. And so that is a person that I think that I will work, and not think, I do know, I will work with them a lot around what economic equity would look like. And so that, I think, is probably what my office will plug in the most, to think about the economic, again, impacts today in construction, and then 20, 30, 40 years from now, what is the economic impact from anything that happens in the project, what all of those projects in the urban mobility office in Portland. Does that answer most of the questions that were asked? No, probably not.
I think so. I'll read them again and follow up. But one comment that you made there, you talked about restorative justice, which reminded me of a question that I have myself in some of what you talked about. You talked about, on one of your slides, it says diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in my own academic department, we have a committee, exactly the same, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And we're having discussions about adding justice to that framework. And you brought up the term justice. And I think it's important when we have all of these discussions about all of these topics, the language and the words that we use really do matter. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk, because I think a lot of people in our audience were at various stages of learning about these issues and discussing them. And so if you could just talk a little bit about your own thoughts about those four terms, diversity, equity, inclusion, and then justice, and maybe what you think justice adds to the effort, the conversation.
So diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think, is thinking about what it looks like to ensure that people from all backgrounds, abilities, race, ethnicities, ages, gender identification, sexual orientation are in a space where they are welcomed, appreciated, and valued, which means that in terms of inclusion, you would need to create a sense of belonging, that you need to be clear that safe spaces really aren't a thing, that you can have a braver space. It might not even necessarily be brave, but that we're always going to have dialogues where people don't agree. We're always going to have some value rubs because of how we've been socialized as individuals and in small groups and in families and towns and parts of the country. And so what does it look like to ensure that all those identities are able to experience spaces and places in a way that they do feel valued and welcomed and heard and appreciated. In terms of inequity in that space, I think that equity points more to decision making and the process that ensures that those things can happen. So that might be resourcing, that might be resourcing in terms of money, investments, it might be resourcing in terms of people. It also might be thinking about how you collaborate in terms of decision or policy movement. I think that not often enough we don't talk about policy shift, right? So I can have a whole bunch of really great programs, but policy is what got us into this space, right? There's things that are written into policy and law. So I think that equity really does point to policy. Justice, so one thing about DEI, which was not always DEI. At one point, I was doing anti-oppression work, and at one point, I was doing freedom work. And I feel like the words move and shift so often. So very recently, which I'm apparently, based on me being very recently looking into it, JEDI is not new at all. But how do you do justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? And I think that justice really is thinking about it's about harm and repairing harm. And that's not just restorative justice, that's just like what justice means. So no matter if you're talking about criminal justice, right? Because in theory, criminal justice would be repairing the harm based on a crime. I think it's seeks to interpret what the harm is and how someone was harmed or how a group of people were harmed, and then how you repair it, and then also how healing happens. So very specifically, when I think about Rose Quarter, like many other neighborhoods, actually, and I don't think about Rose Quarter. When I think about the historic Albina neighborhood, like many other neighborhoods throughout the country where a major freeway ran through it, we are talking about justice in a lot of different ways. And I think that justice is necessary. And I also know that like ODOT cannot offer the justice alone, because some of the things that were lost, some of the things that, some of the harm that was done, yes, that's why the curation is important, because it's a catalyst, right? The expressway was a catalyst to a lot of things, and then all these other things happened because of that. So that collaboration around having that team, because now to even try to repair that harm or heal, if we just remove the expressway, that wouldn't happen. So who do I need to collaborate with to think about the healing part of it, and the repairing and the healing part in places where people aren't appreciated and valued and their voices not at the table. So I do think there's place for justice. I think that it makes sense. I'm an advocate of justice. And I also wonder, Nicatress Perkins herself as an individual, I gotta say that very clearly, wonders how well systems, large state, federal systems, based on current policy and procedure, how well they can deliver on justice like in 2020. I hope that they can, but what kind of plan do we make for that? And is that something we can deliver? Maybe. I want it to, and I do think it has a place there to really think about who's been harmed, what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs moving forward. I think is where justice meets those other three.
So maybe you could just quickly sort of where your office is in the structure of ODOT, and then sort of how, if you've had any time yet to think about how a statewide office will relate to sort of this, the urban rural issues that might arise.
Yeah, so the Office of Social Equity, so I'm an assistant director, so I report directly to Director Strickler. So, and at this exact moment, the Office of Social Equity is myself, and then an intern, and then the Office of Civil Rights sits in our office as well. So the Office of Civil Rights and what they do, I feel like is very easily defined, right? Like they do a lot of our really amazing programs around minority contracting, Title VI, ADA. Like there's really clear things that we need to figure out how not only do we comply with, but how we build a stronger culture around making sure those things are met and done well. For the most part, internally, right? Like they're looking at internal systems that affect the public because of how we work. As I think about building out the Office of Social Equity, there's been a couple of things that I've tried or am trying that I think are important. Talk about building a reliable team. I think that this reliable team will come from people who already work at ODOT in different ways. So I really tried hard to figure out a way to involve people from every region in talking about equity as often as possible and thinking about it. And so there's a group of 53 people who are sit in every region, including the DMV, where we do talk about equity and like from your role, what does that mean? People are managers, people are customer service, people are engineers, people are hiring managers, people are in HR, people are in project delivery. So they're in all those spaces. It is a way to think about it. I do, and this might not be the final answer, right? In terms of this is exactly the team, but I do think that's how it's going to happen. So I've been able to now visit almost every region, but have spent some time in regions 4 and 5, which are Eastern Oregon, and it is different. And spending a lot of time in rural Wisconsin and understanding what it means to live in a city that's, and we're a city, right, of 2,100 or 900 people in our amazing city. That's a different reality. But the needs of people aren't different. And so understanding who lives there and their needs and the intersection of their needs and their needs for access will happen because people who are living there are a part of the conversation and for social equity for the agency. So I do think it will become embedded with a very small team that reports out of the director's office, myself and maybe 2 more people who report out of the director's office, who are engaging and consistently involving people, where there's like maybe 10% of your job for 100 people in different regions. Really think about social equity, still really figuring that out and putting feelers on how that could work. But I do not think that building a statewide like Office of Social Equity where there's 10 of us and we are just like pointing to programs, I don't know if that will work. It might work if we do subjects, like if there's economic, and then there's, we're thinking about economic justice. Now we're using the word justice, right? Like I use economic justice and racial justice and ability justice, and we really focus on those agency wide. And then we plug into the different parts of the state, but plugging into where people already are and are thinking about equity in the places that they live, I think are important, because people aren't working in Bend or in Pendleton and they live there. So it's important to plug them into those equity conversations.
Great. So we are at 12:29 p.m. There's a couple straggling questions, but I think we're going to have to end on time. But we will send them to you.
Okay.
I am going to take over my screen. Sorry, I didn't have that set up. And first, we do want to thank you, Nikatris, for your presentation and the discussion. And we are testing something new. It may have been hard to hear, but those were some applause. We normally we're in a room together and there would be applause, and so my colleague Professor Monsieur has engineered a way for that to happen audibly, at least. So we really want to thank you for joining us. And before we sign off, and again, we've already warned our speaker that it's abrupt, I want to remind everyone that if you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter so you can hear about the next seminars and webinars and other events that we are having. In addition, right after you sign off, you're going to get a quick survey, and hopefully you will spend just a couple minutes to give us some feedback. And again, we'll be sending you links to the recording and the slides later. So with that, we're going to end, and I want to thank you all, and particularly thank you, Nikatris, for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.